Welcome to Behavior and Risk, where we explore the intersection of decisions, the brain, uncertainty, and the business world. I'm John Burkhart.
And I'm Rich Loria.
We're glad you took a chance on us today. I have a particular fondness for real-world absurdities, and that appetite makes up really the bulk of my social media consumption. About a year ago, I noticed something on the Florida Man channel. Almost overnight, it seemed, there were regular jokes and memes about something called Brightline. To read about it on the Florida Man feed, Brightline was either some monstrous entity that was eating people, or people were being sacrificed to appease it. My curiosity was definitely piqued, so I Googled it and learned that Brightline is a train operating in central and southern Florida, and it seemed like there were a lot of deaths associated with it. Now, while the handful of articles I came across certainly sounded bad, I'm not a railway expert. I don't know what's normal, what isn't, so I thought it was important to really get some facts. Between my own digging and the efforts of our crack research team, here's what I've learned. Brightline is a privately owned intercity train operating in Florida, providing transit between the Orlando and Miami metro areas. From terminus to terminus, it spans 235 miles, completing the trip in 3 hours and 25 minutes, average speed of 69 miles an hour, and peak operating speed of 125 miles per hour. This is definitely within the range of what is considered a high-speed rail in the United States. Fundraising, permitting, and regulatory compliance applications began in 2013. Ground was broken in mid-2014, and passenger operations commenced in January of 2018. Brightline is currently owned and operated by Florida East Coast Industries, a large holding company overseeing various transit, infrastructure, and commercial real estate interests throughout Florida. And through the 2024 calendar year, Brightline is averaging 229,000 passengers per month. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Since 2017, Brightline has seen more than 110 fatalities resulting from collisions, and this number underestimates the real scope of the issue. Operations on Brightline were severely curtailed between 2020 and 2021 due to the COVID pandemic. So if we look purely at 2022 and 2023, there were 51 deaths from Brightline collisions in that 2-year span alone. At present, Brightline averages 1 death per 38,000 miles traveled. And again, I emphasize, I'm not a railway expert. That sounds bad, but I mean, is that good? Is that bad? Average? In point of fact, it is the worst fatality rate of any railway in the United States, and 3 times worse than the second worst culprit, Caltrain. Caltrain is averaging 1 death per 125,000 miles, as opposed to Brightline, 1 death per 38,000 miles. And for an even broader comparison, we look at Amtrak, which is the closest thing we have to a national rail system. Amtrak sees 1 collision death per 15.3 million miles traveled. Now, Rich, I know we use slightly different normalizations in our research, but this is anywhere, if you're doing the math in your head, this is anywhere between 400 and 500 times difference between Brightline and Amtrak. 3 orders of magnitude difference in the collision fatality rate between these rails. In fairness, yes, most of Amtrak's rails do lie outside of major urban areas, but it's still a 400 to 500-fold difference between the largest rail system in the country and Brightline. So I think it's pretty clear to say that, yes, there is genuinely a problem here. It's not just perception. The Brightline train is meaningfully and substantively more dangerous than other rail systems in the country. But why is Brightline so dangerous? And here's really the huge risk management question. Given that we know how dangerous it is, why is nothing being done?
That's a great tee up, John, and thank you for putting this all together to set the stage for what is going on at Brightline, the dark angel of the rails.
I love that, by the way.
And I will just put it this way to you. I don't know how any institution or any regulator can tolerate a death rate where there is 1 fatality, not even 1 collision or incident, happening every 2 weeks. That is mind-boggling.
And I think it's important to point out that all of this is publicly available data. Like we did not do some deep confidential investigative dive. We use Wikipedia and available newspaper articles. This is not a hidden fact. People are very aware of this.
On top of that, John, there are also YouTubers that have made a public issue out of this. So it is not as if you and I went to great lengths to dig this up. There are many concerned citizens, including, of course, many Floridians, who are very, very nervous about the current state of their safety in terms of getting around Florida, which has traditionally been a state where you get around using a car.
Yeah, there's fear in the air, which is a weird thing to say about trains in the United States. We don't really give a lot of thought to trains in the States, but somehow this is grabbing attention in some of the worst ways. And yet, for all that attention, there doesn't seem to be any real response, any substantive response from either Brightline itself or from Federal Rail Administration, from local authorities, from anybody who has any measure of oversight over the Brightline train. I know that there have been inquiries. It's not as though the authorities and the powers that be have simply turned a blind eye to it. They've definitely looked and said, okay, we've heard the reports. We've heard that there are problems occurring in Brightline. Are they real and what's going on? And what I've seen is they keep coming back and saying, because there have been a few, they keep coming back and saying, yes, there is a higher than typical rate of fatalities, of collisions, but everything is appropriate with the trains and the infrastructure itself. That Brightline has met its due diligence and compliance requirements for installing crossing guards and safety measures. And these are occurring because of primarily two factors: suicides and people attempting to cross against the signal. And I know we talked about this before, Rich. This is something that when I first read it, my my sort of pedestrian brain said, okay, that kind of makes sense. I do occasionally see people in cars trying to cross flashing please stop signs at railways, and I always think, wow, that seems crazy, and I would never do that, but I do see it happening, and I that sort of makes sense to me. But the longer it sat with me, the more this feels like an a complete passing of the buck. I have more and more problems the longer I think about this. Because what this response is saying is that we recognize that there is a problem. We understand that people are dying here, but it's not our fault, so we don't have to do anything. This is an abdication of risk management. And one of the things that I keep coming back to is that you can make a really compelling argument that the most valid case for regulation is to protect people when they don't have the knowledge or means to protect themselves. So if we're saying that people are killing themselves and are trying to cross when they shouldn't, that's a spot for regulation. Well, that's what regulation is for. And it seems as though, for whatever reason, there's no appetite for this. And I know you have some really interesting thoughts around the suicide rates and the pedestrian crossings.
Yes, so I to address the 2 points you've just brought up, John, let me first address the suicides. I would buy into the issue being a suicide one if Florida had an abnormally high level of suicides, because then getting to the point about the correct intervention, maybe then it's not about the crossings themselves. Maybe all of the safety aspects are properly in place. And maybe the issue is more one of a mental health issue. However, I would conclude, at least initially, that that's not the case because upon some preliminary research, the Florida suicide rate is 13.2 people per 100,000. Now, while that may not sound so great, the national average for the entire United States is 24, or almost double that per 100,000 people in the United States. And where Florida ranks is 37th in the country, which indicates to me that, at least from what I can tell, there's not really a suicide problem in Florida. So I don't think that's a valid way to go in terms of an intervention to try to reduce these deaths.
it's conceivable, I suppose, that, oh, there's a cluster of suicides that occurs that's much above the state average between Orlando and Miami, but one that seems wholly improbable that you would be 2 to 3 standard deviations beyond the state average within this unique corridor. And two, there would be a certain irony that suicide rates are highest in the town of the Magic Kingdom. If I'm thinking about where I'd go to be happy, I'm thinking about Miami and I'm thinking about Disney.
Yes, I'm thinking about South Beach too.
Exactly. So I tend to agree. I think that is a bit of a distraction. I'm sure there have been suicides, and the fact that Brightline is genuinely a high-speed rail probably does mean it's a, I hate to use this term, I don't mean to say it as a positive thing, but it is probably a useful suicide tool. Again, I emphasize, please do not in any way construe that as an endorsement. If you are considering suicide, get help. But I think it is a level of passing the buck or telling people, oh, look over here. Don't look at the real problem. Now, if we look at other factors that drive this, then okay, let's look at pedestrians crossing against the signal or crossing inappropriately or unsafely when there's a train coming. This is something that I know for fact has been a problem in other municipalities when high-speed rails have come into place where there have already been slow-moving freight trains. People have built up habits around how they behave at rail crossings. I've been in rural areas in the past where when a freight train comes, you know that you're sitting at that crossing for a good 5 to 10 minutes. And that's, even though it's not that long, it ruins the rest of your day. You're not happy the rest of the day. And there is a tendency of, okay, if I can sort of squeeze through these railings, or in many cases, it's just a flashing light and no actual rails, I'm going to do it because I'd rather zip across and not get stuck here for however long the freight train is going to be. But of course, when you have a high speed rail, that window of being able to cross safely is vastly smaller, it's vastly quicker. And it has been a problem in many municipalities where when a high speed rail comes in, people have these habits. We know that habit is a really powerful driver of what people do. Even knowing that there are high-speed trains coming along the rails, people are going to default to their existing habits.
That is true, John. They will do that. And let me just touch a little bit on some statistics with regards to crossings.
Yeah,
So,
please.
so being an actuary, one of the things we always think about with regards to the potential for claims or losses is exposure to loss. Exposure is a very important concept in risk management, particularly anything regarding health and safety. So let me just quote some statistics here. And at first, they may not seem particularly striking, but I'm going to bring in a very relevant example that will mark a stark contrast between a train line that you and I are very familiar with, called the Northeast Corridor, versus the rail line for Brightline between Orlando and Miami. So let me just put this here in context. So at first, when I did some research on this, I found that for the Miami Orlando line, there are 315 crossings across 235 miles, or roughly about 1.33 crossings per mile. I compared that to what our research team came up with regards to the amount of crossings for all rail lines in the United States. Those numbers are 212,000 crossings over 140,000 miles, or 1.5 crossings per mile. So it would seem on the surface that Brightline actually has maybe even a slightly under average exposure rate. However, to your earlier point, much of the US rail system is not high-speed rail. Much of it today includes freight trains. So that comparison is not particularly apt. Comparing Brightline's Orlando-Miami route to the Northeast Corridor of Amtrak is, in my opinion, a better analogy. And do you know how many crossings there are on the Northeast Corridor.
I've ridden that line a lot of times in both coming from DC and coming from Boston to New York. And I've not counted, but I don't think there's many. I think I would guess well under 50.
It's even less than that. It's even less than that. It's all of nine.
9 total?
There are nine total crossings, all within very unpopulated areas of the state of Connecticut.
So that's not remotely what we would consider a normal distribution. We have a really clustered concentration of crossings in one state that geographically is not huge in regards to the Northeast Corridor, and all in very unpopulated areas. Okay, so that if I go to my risk management brain, I would say that's a really good distribution of exposure. You've put your potential sources of exposure in an area where you have a very low probability of people encountering them. I like that. That's good risk management.
On top of that, there are occasional trains that are high speed along the Northeast Corridor. In particular, the Acela Express, which reaches a top speed of 150 miles per hour.
I don't know.
However,
I've ridden the Acela Express a lot of times. I've been delayed enough times. I don't think it's actually high speed, but this is neither here nor there. Nominal 150, you said?
nominal 150, but to your point, there are very small stretches where that train ever reaches that speed.
Yeah, it's for the most part, it feels like just a normal rail line when you're riding that as a passenger. And I'm going purely by recollection here. I've not done research to this, but I have ridden that train a number of times between Boston and New York, and it doesn't feel fast. It feels as though you've got one or two spots which are very long, straight stretches in the middle of trees or right along the coastline where you'll accelerate a little bit, and it feels like it never goes higher than 50 or 60 for most of the way.
That's correct, John. Whereas the Brightline train not only reaches a maximum speed of 125 miles per hour, but its average speed is almost 70 miles per hour, which means that for large stretches of the Miami Orlando route, it is going at a very high speed.
And yeah, if we think the average is 70 and the number of stops that are along that line, it's got to be moving. It's got to be moving really fast.
Exactly. And there are YouTube videos. There are a number of YouTubers out there that have filmed these trains going through some of these crossings, and they're in very populated areas. And these trains are moving at very high speed. It is frightening.
And I know we've talked about this. This has been a bit of a passion project of mine for a few months now. We've talked about this a lot. I keep coming back to the question of how did this happen? I know we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. There's a few more factors around the people, the pedestrians and the drivers and the residents, but what was the thinking in putting in lines that fast in highly populated, highly residential areas? Again, if I think both as a behavioral scientist and as a risk manager, I think this does not make a ton of sense.
It depends on your definition of risk. Risk includes many dimensions, not just the safety aspect of it, although that's what you and I have been focused on in this podcast so far. But I believe what Brightline is doing and has successfully done to date is they are addressing a pain point, in particular, an economic and convenience pain point for Floridians by offering a non-auto vehicle alternative and removing cars from the road and therefore reducing traffic through the ability for individuals to just sit on a train and go between two actually very highly populated and very popular areas of the state.
That's an interesting point. When we start looking at that in economic terms, then a very different calculus comes in. And given your actuary background, you may argue that you can express the safety terms in economic terms.
Well, it is a great point. There are a number of government agencies that have attempted to put a value per life, both in terms of mortality and in terms of general morbidity. So there are mechanisms for doing that in terms of public policy and decision making. However, I would argue I don't think any of that calculus so far has come into play with regards to the Brightline project, which
And
in some ways makes sense because Brightline is a private profit making enterprise. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but because of that, the idea of including any sort of life or morbidity type of calculus in this may not be at the top of their agenda.
and I would completely concur with that. I know that I've teed up this episode so far asking, "Oh, why is this happening? This is so unclear." We both have a lot of thoughts about this. We've been thinking about this for a number of months. And I think there's some, when we start looking at the makeup of the Brightline leadership and some of the interactions that they've had with regulatory agencies, I think we start seeing a lot of very clear cognitive and behavioral and economic reasons why this has persisted as it has. Your point that they're not necessarily doing that actuarial calculus of what is the value of a human life, I think that's supported when we look at the background and history of the Brightline leadership team. We're not going to name any names because I don't want anybody to go ahead and say this person is evil. We don't have nearly enough information to say anybody involved here is evil. Misguided or perhaps making problematic judgments, sure, but one of the themes of this podcast is we all make problematic judgments sometimes, and those judgments are highly shaped by the biases that we carry with us. If we look at this leadership team, one of the things that jumps out to me is that there is a shocking lack of experience in the transit industry, trains or otherwise. There's a handful, one or two, but there's a hugely disproportionate representation of people from entertainment and hospitality industries. Now, to some extent, I suppose this is to be expected if they were hiring locally. Florida has enormous hospitality and entertainment sectors. They're two of their biggest contributors to Florida GDP. But this does bring a really particular shape of thinking. It goes to availability and representativeness heuristics that we use what we are familiar with in making our judgments. If something is readily available to us, it must be important. And if it's not something we've thought about a whole lot in the past, it's probably not important. And if you're coming from the entertainment sector, if you're coming from Disney, let's say, hopefully there's very little cause to think about what's the potential value of somebody dying in the park.
Those are all good points. And one thing I'll just add to that is not only are none of the executive team or few of the executives from the rail or transportation industry, but there is no background in regulation at all among any of the executives. So there is no connection to the FRA or the NTSB. There is no connection to any of those entities. And you would think, given a brand new startup that has been around the block for a little over a decade, that you want to bring in somebody with that type of background to help navigate how to properly put a rail system in place, considering all aspects, including safety as well as economic benefits.
Yeah, it just seems as though they've almost gone out of their way to put together a problematic decision-making structure, to put together a leadership team that is almost bound to come up with a completely inappropriate risk management framework, just because the shapes of risks that they are accustomed to processing and mitigating against are not those that you're going to encounter as a transit operator in general and a railway operator in particular. In fairness, they do have a handful of people who do have rail experience. It's not a lot of rail experience before they join Brightline, but there is some rail experience that's come in. And these do seem to be one or two of the operational people, and they do seem to have longstanding tenure with the organization. But this makes me wonder about how they've thought about the people. When we look at the findings that we just referred to, where regulatory entities have said, oh, most of these collisions are occurring because pedestrians and drivers are not familiar with proper procedure at high speed rails and therefore trying to cross against a signal or are standing or parking too close to it. This seems to me as though the Brightline operations team basically disregarded something that would be very foreseeable in terms of pedestrian and driver behavior. I wonder to what extent is this what we could talk about sometimes as the curse of knowledge? Those people who did come in with really the entirety of their career in railway operations, coming in too close to the safety procedures, coming in too close to the risk management of it, having the very well established knowledge that these are dangerous. I know these are dangerous, and I know that I shouldn't walk close to it, and I know that I shouldn't try to cross against the signal, and disregarding and ignoring the habits that people are going to have. We talk about the curse of knowledge across lots of domains that once you know something, it's impossible to unknow it, and therefore impossible to exclude or factor out of your assessments of risk, of exposure, of probability. Do you have any thoughts on that, or am I just chasing down a wild hare here?
No, you're not chasing down a wild hare in any way, shape, or form, John. What this feeds into and what this ignores, and again, this is where things can become catastrophic when you add them together on a behavioral standpoint, is by having this curse of knowledge, it is explicitly ignoring individual loss aversion, as you referred to earlier, your own personal experience of having to wait at a train intersection for freight trains to pass is very frustrating. And even though it might be just 5 or 10 minutes out of your entire life, it can seem an eternity when you're sitting there waiting for the train to pass. And then there's even a delay for maybe another minute or two until the crossing comes up and the lights stop blinking. That loss aversion is very, very powerful. People hate the feeling of wasting time. On top of that, I would suggest that they're also ignoring the inherent optimism in all of us that gets us up in the morning to do what we do. And the general feeling that, yeah, those bad things I read about, that car I saw hit on YouTube, that's not going to happen to me. Things like that don't happen to me. And you know why? Because they probably never had. Because if they had, you wouldn't be here to still be optimistic about it.
I talk about that in class many times that the fact that you're still alive, that simple fact fuels every piece of optimism bias that you have.
And furthermore, as you and I have talked about, overconfidence is rampant. And our dear departed friend, Daniel Kahneman, talks about the curse of overconfidence extensively in many interviews and in many of his writings. Individuals, as they are approaching these crossings, are understandably overconfident in their ability to judge whether they are going to make it or not. And therefore, their judgments become skewed. It is tragic, but that is what is happening. And the thing that we don't know, the data we don't have, John,
Hmm.
are the near misses,
Yeah.
which is something that's very, very important in any risk management system. That we don't have. And I'm not sure we could get without some type of video surveillance over a period of time.
I wonder to what extent that would exist. I imagine going after that would probably be, even if it does exist, would be very challenging because I'm sure that the powers that be probably don't want that being made public. It would probably be terrifying for the public at large to see just how many times does the bright line nearly hit somebody. As you said, we're right now, if we look at the rates for 2022 and 2023 and extrapolate that, it's a collision, not just a collision, excuse me, a fatality every 2 weeks, more or less. That's an astronomically high rate. So that near miss data, we have to imagine, well, I say that again, I don't actually know railway operations, but I would imagine it's easily that again, or possibly even twice as high.
There could be a near miss almost every day. If we are to extrapolate the data from fatalities. We know that fatalities are part of collisions, so that means that there are more collisions going on, the higher frequency there. And then if we combine that all together with near misses, that means there's some kind of event. And I would argue there's probably a good number of near misses out there. There are things going on almost every day at one of these 315 crossings.
I would believe that. It's such a populated region. There's almost no way that you would have, at a bare minimum, somebody standing too close or parked too close within 5 to 10 feet of a high-speed rail going past. And yeah, I can absolutely see how through just sheer inattention, you could easily end up, even through no attempt to cross, ending up in a situation where you are imperiled, where your life is in danger because of the proximity to this train. So this all really speaks to why these collisions are occurring. What was the thinking around the design, and why are we neglecting very readily foreseeable behaviors by drivers and pedestrians? But it doesn't really explain, once these collisions started happening, once these fatalities started happening, why was nothing done? Why has there been so little response when there is a clear and unambiguous problem of collisions and fatalities on the Brightline train? I have a few thoughts. I think that one of the things we can't really ignore is the relative youth of the Brightline rail system, that they commenced on paper in 2013 and had 4 or 5 years of construction and fundraising, and they've only really been in operations for about 7 years. And the relative value, the relative investment of any sort of corrective measures, whether it be removing or rerouting lines, which would probably be a last resort for people because that had to be infrastructurally, that would be catastrophic, to just putting in better safety gates or louder or more visible flashers, has to weigh very heavily against what they've just finished spending in terms of construction. We talk about intertemporal discounting, that phenomenon where the further away in time something occurs, the less weight we attribute to it. And if they had built this, let's say 50 years ago, and they were facing these fatalities now, the initial investment would feel like much less, and therefore the corrective measures would not feel like they were part of that same calculus. Whereas they've just finished construction and they are commencing construction on other projects, which we'll talk about down the road here. I have to imagine this feels like an enormous potential loss to do corrective measures, to implement any sort of safety measures beyond what they've already done, and admitting failure in what they have done, that what they did up front was not enough.
So there's a number of things going on here, John. First off, you've alluded to the sunk cost fallacy, which is a significant issue in many organizations with regards to project management and any form of capital budgeting. So management, to your point, may feel as if we've already spent all this money updating the tracks, the existing freight train tracks that they are coexisting their Brightline trains with, to make that work. And I'm sure that they spent quite a bit of money to do that. Doing anything different or making a significant change to that would require a whole other new investment. And look, I will say that if you really want to solve this problem, you need to reduce the amount of exposure.
Absolutely. But I think that getting to that point of reducing exposure, of getting the buy-in, and not just buy-in, getting the acceptance that we need to reduce this exposure, requires a new way of looking at what's happening. I don't know what the boardroom meetings are like at Brightline or their parent company. I don't know what the procedures are in place, but to my external eye and just looking at what's happening, it absolutely appears to me as though they are not assessing their risks and their responsibilities adequately. This seems like a failure on their part. Are they responsible? Have they met their obligations in terms of what the permitting authorities and regulatory authorities required for them to build? Yes, Absolutely. All documentation suggests so. But have they met their obligation in terms of the practical reality of how people are behaving? Not at all. And seeing that, being a responsible entity, business, private, or otherwise, demands that you proceed differently, that you correct your own approach and do what you can to reduce the exposure because you are creating exposure not just for yourself, but for pedestrians who have nothing to do with your own organization.
So I'll address that in a couple of ways, John. First off, there's been reinforcement from a behavioral standpoint. And when I say reinforcement, who am I referring to?
The regulators who have brought no consequences down upon them.
Absolutely. And furthermore, I would also refer to the general public, because even though there has been some outrage and some isolated instances of complaints and certain actions by individuals, particularly those YouTubers who have documented how fast these trains go and have even documented grotesquely some of the accidents, they've been largely supported by the public. The public is thrilled because, again, to my earlier point, this whole Brightline project solves a major pain point for many Floridians. Yes, they're running these trains through highly populated areas, areas that are congested with traffic. And I just want to take a step back and say, on a certain level, I actually applaud what Florida is trying to do. And that may sound surprising. My problem isn't that they are addressing this pain point, because I will tell you, having spent much of my career flying in and out of Atlanta, Atlanta never solved the issue of too many cars after they got the 1996 Olympics, and to this day remains an absolute nightmare to drive into and out of during rush hour.
As I sit here in Boston, I'll say, I don't know what you're talking about.
Florida is trying to get ahead of what they foresee as massive population expansion, especially with more and more people retiring, more and more of us here in the Northeast moving to Florida, like my brother and a very good friend of mine, both living about an hour away from each other. So therefore, I get it that they're trying to get ahead of this. The problem is how they are trying to do it. And what they are trying to do is steeped in a combination of initial anchoring to an existing system. So instead of trying to build something from scratch, which not just the money aspect, but just the expediency of it, it makes more sense to use existing infrastructure. So let's just anchor to whatever we've got here, refurbish it, make a few technical changes, and make it work. And voila, you're done. And then now there's some uncertainty because there are issues with the safety aspects of this. But without any penalties, without any accountability being assigned to management, they're just going to continue doing what they're doing with maybe a few tweaks here or there. So they have tried to buttress a number of these crossings with additional signage, with additional gates or bigger or stronger gates, and longer wait times. So longer lead times and longer wait times while trains are crossing. So they've done a number of these things around the edges, but they haven't been asked to make any huge changes because I think there's a certain amount of regulatory capture going on, which we haven't directly addressed.
That was actually next on my list to ask about is why aren't the regulators being more firm about this?
Because they are waiting in terms of their own risk management calculus, the overall economy and the overall urban planning of the state. So that has gotten additional weight. They are exhibiting a certain amount of conflict aversion with management, they realize if they step up regulation, that is going to make what has been, from my perception, a at least collegial relationship between the regulators and Brightline. It's going to make that by necessity contentious. So I think some of this does come back on the regulators who have decided to, as along with management, so they are aligned with management in this way. They have aligned the economics over the general public health and safety.
I also have to wonder, since the implementation of mass transit does seem to be a high priority for Florida, that comes from state legislature and from gubernatorial interests. That comes from a higher level than just the local regulatory authorities themselves. I have to wonder then, is there some sense of perhaps misalignment of interests or self-interest on the part of the regulators where nobody wants to be seen as somebody who is hanging up or introducing friction into one of the state's flagship transit projects? I have to wonder if you are the investigative lead for a Brightline crash, how hard are you actually going to look for fault at Brightline if the state itself is going to take a dim view of you introducing additional cost or introducing delayed wait times or construction delays into their flagship project? We see that in various federal agencies and some of the work that we do where people don't want to be seen to be stopping projects, even if there is merit in doing so, because somebody higher up has it as kind of a pet project. And this creates its own sense of loss aversion with the regulators. I don't want to lose my job. I don't want to lose my position. I don't want to be seen as the problematic employee. I want to emphasize we don't have any specific documentation or indicators of this. We've not seen there, we're not privy to the minutes of the investigations. We've not read the reports. I can't in any way point at something and say, this is what's happening. I simply have to wonder.
I think that's valid. Even though we don't have any direct evidence in terms of documentation or conversations or recordings that would necessarily support that point of view, I only have to look at some of the outcomes of the reports from the National Transit Safety Board and the other regulators that have been examining some of these specific incidents. When I read some of these reports, which are very brief, they appear to me to confirm the ongoing narrative that the issue is one of the general public. And it's not just these regulatory reports, John. It's also how the issue is being dealt with. So while I pointed to before some of the things that Brightline management have done to try to, on the margins, strengthen some of these crossings, where the regulators have come into play and where it ties back into there's something at a higher level likely going on is in terms of legislation, which has been to say, okay, we're going to now fine people who try to beat these crossings. So if you're not going to take care of yourself for yourself, then we're going to hit your wallet.
And I've talked about this in class a number of times that behavior change by punishment is really not a terribly effective approach. Just in general, behaviorally, and when you look at it in terms of legal enforcement, it's such an ineffective way of getting people to do something. It presupposes that there's somebody there to enforce it and that the fine is meaningful enough to actually be relevant.
That's true. And in this case, I'm not even sure without cameras or anything else how you would even go about enforcing this. And again, to your point, whether the fine would be meaningful enough for these people.
It seems as though the only people you could reliably find would be those who were hit by a train, and that just feels like adding insult to injury.
Certainly does. So this new regulation, which has been around now for about maybe 6 months to a year, along with what has come out of the reports, the investigations of these different incidents, all point to me confirmation bias. Not only confirmation bias, confirming the story that the problem is the general public doing things they shouldn't be doing, but it also points to authority bias in that the regulators are largely counting on the regulated Brightline management and Brightline employees to say, yep, they're doing all the right things, and we're going to rely on that. We know we're going to trust them, and we're going to go with whatever they're doing.
And that to me speaks to an over reliance on what people should do instead of what people will do.
That's correct. Now, one last aspect I wanted to bring to this before we turn to our wrap up is the public service announcement that has been put out by Brightline.
Hmm.
So, Brightline, in addition to strengthening the safety features at each of the crossings, they also came up with a public service announcement to try to get in people's heads. So, again, this all comes around. It's about the general public. It's about Joe Q public and what they're doing or what they're not doing. And they came up with this public service announcement, which is a list of do's and don'ts when you approach a crossing. So if you see the light coming on, you should stop automatically. Don't try to cross it, right? Things like that. And there's a whole list of them in the public service announcement. It's well intended. And I'm not going to say it won't have any impact, but that public service announcement has been out there for a while now. And as you pointed out, there have been incidents very recently. So there's still people not paying attention to it. In my opinion, I compare this public service announcement to what I've seen with regards to recent smoking ads in my neck of the woods, where they actually show people who've had throat operations, people who can barely talk, people who are barely alive, who smoked their whole lives. That scares the heck out of me. And it should scare the heck out of a lot of people. So the problem with Brightline's very nice little pledge, where you say, please promise, do this and don't do that, is that there's nothing visceral for people to grasp at.
It has very low salience, we would say.
Perfect. Perfect. Much better said than I could say it.
And to your, I'm just thinking about this from an information processing point of view. It seems as though there's just too much information. It's an informative communication that is very high density, and it's being deployed in scenarios where people are going to give it maybe 2 to 3 seconds of attention. They're not going to be able to, they're not going to care to process this information. And even if they do, they're not going to be able to process as much as being put in front of them. Now you contrast this to the smoking ads that you're, excuse me, anti-smoking ads that you're describing, and that requires very little attentional bandwidth. You see it and you immediately know what it's about, and it hits you in a way that tells you this is a risk I need to be aware of and take care of. So it seems as though this is really, it would be very reductive to say that the dangers and fatalities and collisions occurring around Brightline are occurring because of X. It feels like this really is a confluence of myriad different factors. We have the established habits of pedestrians and drivers. We have various interests and certain checklist approaches by Brightline itself. We have certain confirmation bias and authority issues from the regulators. And all of these really conspire to create this, call it perfect storm of poor train crossing behavior. Now, I think all of these are genuinely issues involved here, but I think there is an additional factor as well that can't necessarily be neglected in terms of why this continues to happen and people not only don't seem to care, but almost look at it with a problematic humor, let's say. And this is what I'm going to, this is my own terminology. This is not an established scientific term, but what I'm going to call the Florida effect. As I mentioned, I learned about this whole scenario from the Florida Man social media feed. This is a channel that is dedicated to ridiculous things that happen in Florida. Think of it as documenting real world absurdist humor. And this feeds into something called normalcy bias, a disregard of things that we perceive to be commonplace. If it happens a whole lot, then, or if we perceive that it happens a whole lot, then it's normal. It's Florida. Weird stuff happens in Florida. How many jokes or anecdotes have you heard where Florida or Floridians is the punchline? Even though it's 400 to 500 times more dangerous than the national average, we don't think that these deaths around the Brightline are all that atypical because it's Florida. What I really have to wonder, though, is if we saw this same sort of thing happening in Minneapolis or Nashville or Denver, would we see the same kind of acceptance or black humor about it? We may actually get the chance to find out. Brightline is currently in the process of expanding, with aspirations to open a train line connecting Las Vegas and Southern California, with passenger operations scheduled to commence in 2028. Let's see what happens with that gambler's ride.
Behavior and Risk is brought to you by Capita Solutions. Behavior and Risk staff includes our research team, Sherry Xu and Jin Zhang, and our editing team, Qingying Gao and Athena Liu. Theme music by Crypt of Insomnia. The opinions presented here are solely those of John Burkhart and Rich Loria and do not represent those of Columbia University, Capita Solutions, or any other organization. We thank you for taking a chance on us today.